Hi, everyone. I'm Yasmin, Research Associate at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to our webinar, Gender-Based Violence in the Lives of Muslim Women in Canada, Realities, Challenges, and Resistance. I want to acknowledge our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoak, and Chinantan nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. We're so happy to be joined today by our three wonderful panelists, Sabrine Azraq with the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, Yasmin Hussain with the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration, and Youssef with Nisa Homes. A link to their complete bios will be shared in the chat box. Welcome, Sabrine, Yasmin, and Yasmin. Would you like to turn your cameras on, please? So I'd like to begin by inviting you each to please tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you are involved in. And if it's all right, if we could start with you, Sabrine.
Yeah, most definitely. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. So currently I work with the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. I manage the first ever legal services coordination program, and it's geared specifically to Muslim women all across Canada. So I administer this program by providing culturally safe legal services coordination to Canadian Muslim women seeking legal advice and counsel. And I also support Muslim women across Canada who face any form of gender-based violence and are in need of supports coordination or financial assistance. And so the two programs that I manage are called the Legal Services Coordination Program and CCMW's Addressing Barriers for Muslim Women and Girls Facing GBV.
Thanks so much, Sabrine. Yasmin H., can I invite you to share more about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Jasmine, and welcome everyone. So I work at the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration. I'll just say MRC for short because it's such a long title. I'm the manager of public education and community programs. And in that role, a lot of my work is supporting the development and implementation of community capacity building and engagement and education strategies that address gender-based violence. So thinking of various prevention strategies, both in terms of developing resources, social media, general awareness, developing groups, facilitating groups that focus on healthy relationship skills, but also building capacity to recognize forms of abuse and thinking about how we respond and support survivors of abuse in our community. We created sort of a prevention-based campaign called It's On Us. And the idea behind that is that, it's on all of us. And so everyone within our community plays a role in tackling and addressing gender-based violence.
Thanks for sharing, Yasmin. And lastly, Yasmin Y., please share more about yourself and your work with Nisa Homes.
Definitely. Thank you. My name is Yasmin Youssef, and I'm the program director at Nisa Homes. Nisa Homes is a group of transitional homes for women and children that are fleeing domestic violence or experiencing homelessness for whatever reason. So we have 10 homes across Canada, literally from coast to coast. And what we try to do as much as possible is provide women that do reach out to us, many of which are Muslim, immigrant, refugee, newcomers, or without status. We give them a place to stay and help them with whatever resources they need to get back on their feet. So things like counseling, case management, childcare, financial assistance, basically ensuring they have the means to get back on their feet and restart their lives. And a big part of it, obviously, is also doing a lot of awareness in the community, both on the prevention side, but also on the education side and awareness of resources like this.
Thanks so much for sharing. The work that you're all doing is so incredibly important, and I know the participants and myself look forward to hearing more about the impacts as we move along the discussion today. So I'd like to start our discussion by inviting you to share your insights on the experiences of violence faced by Muslim women in Canada based on your work and experience. In order to prevent future violence and to better support survivors, we really need to reclaim the narrative that's often associated with Muslim women and dismantle the myths and negative stereotypes that are associated with Muslim women, both as individuals and as survivors. And so Sabrine, I'd like to invite you to share some of the myths that you see come up in your work that you would like to see dismantled when it comes to supporting and addressing violence against Muslim women.
Yeah, most definitely. So when we say violence against Muslim women, we're really talking about gendered Islamophobia, as well as gender-based violence. And so when it comes to Islamophobic violence, we know that it's both racist violence and often a form of gender-based violence. We also know that research shows that Muslim women are the primary targets of Islamophobic violence, whether it's here or in Europe. We know that gendered Islamophobia manifests itself in various ways. So it's a way that we work to make Muslim women seem weak, oppressed, repressed, or seem as if they are victims. And then we know that there are various kinds of gendered Islamophobia. So it could be structural gendered Islamophobia, which is, the ways in which government agencies have been operating. And it manifests itself in a way where it looks like a lack of food security, lack of access to affordable housing or childcare, employment, and so forth. And then there's institutionalized gendered Islamophobia. So that can look at the ways in which police go through trainings and other institutions that create this dominant narrative of Muslim women as meek, as oppressed, and so forth. And then we have interpersonal Islamophobia, which is really focused on hate violence, which translates into you don't belong here. And that violence could most definitely be forms of gender-based violence. And then of course we have internalized Islamophobia. So that's really Muslim women ourselves and the ways in which we can internalize the negative dominant views against us. So, an example of this could be if I see someone who seems more religious, I may assume that they are more oppressed. So that's one way that internalized Islamophobia can show itself. But I know for the focus of this talk, we really want to focus on gender-based violence. And so one myth that I really want to focus on is that this view that it is specific to Muslim women, when we know very well that gender-based violence is a global phenomenon, that it exists in all societies and in all communities, and that it's directed at someone because of their gender, irregardless of their race or their status, and so forth. And so really want to emphasize that it's a problem that cuts across all races, ethnicities, cultures, and religion. And that here in Canada, about once a week, a woman is killed by her partner in Canada. And there's so many stats that we can focus on, that women in Canada are more likely than men to be sexually assaulted. And just really focusing on the fact that GBV is prevalent in Muslim communities as it is in other communities. So that's one point that I'd really like to emphasize on.
Thanks so much, Sabrine. You've definitely touched on some important points to get us started. Yasmine, what about you? Any myths that you see come up in your work that you'd like to tackle?
Yeah, I think what Sabrine mentioned, I think, was a very important starting point. I think some of the things that we see in on the ground with the services that we provide is the concept that Muslims are just one group and we're all the same and we look the same and act the same. The reality is Muslims are a very diverse group. I think one of the most diverse in the world. We, everything from the sects that we have to the languages we speak, countries of origin, the way that we practice, our ethnic backgrounds, all of that is so diverse. And so even in having this discussion, we need to understand that we might be saying some generalized statements, but again, it is different for each and every single person that we interact with, and we need to approach it from that perspective that we're dealing with a human being, regardless of what their religion is, regardless of where they're coming from. The basis has to be that they should be treated with the same equitable and the same inclusive resources and services as anyone else. Having these conversations is really important to understand what they might be coming with and their perspective and how to support them. But it should not be, you're Muslim, therefore you must be doing X, Y, Z. Just the diversity in and of itself allows for so much diversity in how we approach them too. So I think that myth is very important to understand, especially as service providers.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Yasmin. Yasmin H, do the points that Sabrine and Yasmin resonate with what you see come up in your work as well?
Absolutely. I think all the points they've raised are critically important. And I would just add to that, I mean, I think drawing on Sabrine's point that when I started this work, there was a lot of sort of culturalization or othering of gender-based violence within Muslim communities. During the time of Stephen Harper, there were the barbaric cultural practices came up, and that really sort of informed a view of how we understand gender-based violence in Muslim communities and position gender-based violence in Muslim communities as sort of other or worse or endemic within or naturalized within Muslim communities. And I think those are important myths to challenge because it ended up creating a savior narrative in terms of thinking that, Muslim women are too oppressed to act, and that the way to create safety for Muslim women is to find ways to disconnect them from their communities or remove them from communities, and that safety within their communities is not possible. And I think that's important to challenge because I think there's all sorts of ways we create safety, and I think we need to respect the agency that Muslim women have in terms of, and survivors have in terms of defining what safety looks like for them, and thinking too about who's involved in this work. And so I know that when the Muslim Resource Center was founded in 2009 by our executive director, Dr. Mohammed Baobaid, there was pushback in terms of thinking about can Muslim based organizations or culturally based organizations, address this work of gender-based violence in a way that really honors the safety or addresses the safety of Muslim women. And so I think that also needs to be challenged.
Thanks, Yasmin. We know the myths and stereotypes and the othering that results can impact service access for Muslim women. In your experience, what are some of the barriers that Muslim women face in seeking gender-based violence supports and healing services? And Sabrine, maybe I'll start with you from a more legal access perspective, just given your work with CCMW.
Yeah, definitely. So really, a lot of Muslim women are just unaware of their rights and what services are available to them. They could be very reluctant to report domestic violence to the police, especially if the abuser is a Muslim man, because they are unaware of what the police will do. They have fears in regards to police, very founded and grounded fears. And there's also, of course, difficulty in accessing culturally sensitive resources after they disclose that they have been victims of gender-based violence. And then there's isolation within their own families and communities and societies. But if we really dig deeper, of course, Muslim women, we really practice intersectionality. So a Muslim woman can also be an immigrant woman and can also be a Black woman. So these barriers are, they're vague, and but they could be specific to Muslim women. So it could be, for example, language barriers, especially for Muslim women who identify as newcomers. It could be really just a lack of information about anti-violence services that are available and accessible. It could be concerns regarding a fear of deportation or what could happen to their immigration status. It could be a general lack of information about the laws in Canada, about their legal rights and how to access justice. And for this, because I do work on legal services, we do find when it comes specifically to divorce or family law in general, because Muslim family law is, there's no one set of Muslim family law, right? In every Muslim majority country, there is a specific set of laws that are different. So for example, I come from Palestine. The Muslim family laws there are distinct from those from, for example, Egypt or Sudan. And so when people come here and they are going through a divorce, there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion regarding their legal rights. So that I think is a very big one. And there's also a fear of fanning the flames of Islamophobia if they speak up. So again, if their abuser identifies as Muslim and they want to speak out against their abuser, there is a fear that they are encouraging a form of Islamophobia, which of course is not a reason to stay silent. But it is something that Muslim women have disclosed to me, a fear of losing their children. There's also a general lack of accommodation in services for cultural or religious needs. So I have quite a few clients who are in shelters in the GTA, specifically in Toronto, who have complained about general mistreatment, but just a lack of accommodation when it comes to their religious needs in terms of food. So they really are looking for halal options. What else am I missing? I know I'm saying quite a lot. Social isolation, I think, is a big one within Muslim communities. And then here, I do want to add that we do have to look at different interpretations of Islam. And some interpretations are highly patriarchal and could put Muslim women at risk of gender-based violence. So I think when we're looking at all the barriers, one of them could definitely be the various interpretations of Islam that people may be into. And then there's also distrust in authorities in Canada, knowing that we are in a settler colonial state that is founded on settler colonialism and racism and Islamophobia. There is a deep distrust in authorities that again is founded and grounded in something very real. And then there's also underemployment, lack of recognition of foreign credentials, concerns about racism and cultural stereotypes from service providers. I mean, the list goes on, but I should stop there.
Thanks, Sabrine. You made some great points. Yasmin H., what are some of the barriers that you see come up in your work, especially with the prevention work that you're involved with?
Yeah, and I would say, like, I think there are so many barriers that overlap and interplay, and that, you know, depending on someone's social location, their identity, as a survivor, those barriers can look different. And so before I talk about the prevention approach too, I want to share that I think, you know, as Yasmin Youssef identified earlier, there is great diversity within Muslim communities. And so I think Muslim survivors who experience gender-based violence, say in a dating relationship, may experience certain barriers in disclosing or feeling safe in disclosing, both within their community, but also maybe to service providers or individuals who are queer Muslims. So I think there are all these other layers that we need to take into account in terms of survivors have different identities, experience, and social locations. And so those barriers will look different at the systemic level, at the level of institutions, at the level of service providers within their communities, and at the individual level. And I think all those are always an interplay. A lot of my work is specifically focused on, is really focused on thinking about how we create safety in community and addressing the reality that all communities have norms. And so even early when addressing this, like a lot of times when we culturalize violence or gender-based violence within Muslim communities, you know, Dr. Anna Korteweg has talked about how, you know, in Canada or in Western countries, there's this idea we have values and norms, but other communities have culture or we have values and we have values, whereas others have culture and different cultural norms that are problematic. And so all violence is rooted in culture and norms in every society, in every community. And I think it's thinking about how those norms are positive in creating safety for women, or how maybe they create barriers for women in terms of disclosing. And I think those barriers, those norms exist in all our communities. And so a lot of the prevention work we do is thinking about how is abuse normalized or minimized in our communities? What does victim blaming sound like? And I think there's specificities of what that sounds like or looks like or how that comes into play. and the barriers that create for women. So they may not feel safe then disclosing to a family or friend, but then there may be such barriers in disclosing or reaching out to services because there's maybe, as Sabrine said, the reality of racism, the fear of children being taken away, the lack of knowledge, the lack of access for all these reasons. And so a lot of my work is thinking about, especially knowing that most women will disclose to someone that they know, is how do we create safety in our immediate circles and within our communities so that women can disclose and that barrier is removed where they have that first access of support from someone they know and can then maybe take further steps. And so I think addressing those sorts of cultural norms, but also creating then safety within community institutions. So a lot of women, or some Muslim women, may want to disclose to faith leaders or community leaders or cultural institutions, and those also need to be safe spaces. And so building the capacity there to really recognize abuse, thinking about recognizing warning signs, taking it seriously, thinking about how our responses may cause further harm and reinforce violence, and then thinking about what support looks like and what is survivor-centered and trauma-informed support, and what can that look like. Another quick point I just want to say, like I know for MRC, like our framework has been using a culturally integrative framework. And so I think in thinking about the barriers, it's also thinking about like what is our service framework and our approach. And so it's really not necessarily always just listing or tackling off these like, okay, this barrier is removed. It is sort of a holistic approach or framework in terms of thinking about how do we recognize or understand the lived experiences of the women we're supporting, survivors we're supporting, and the social context they're in, their worldview and their values. And so, as Yasmin said, that will look different for different Muslim women. So taking into consideration migration experiences or migration trauma, their social location and identity. And so I think it's really thinking at our approach very holistically and understanding that we need to have a sort of a culturally integrative approach and framework that allows us to think about safety much more broadly and more flexibly.
Thanks, Yasmin. We'll be chatting about culturally relevant programming soon, so hold on to your thoughts. Yasmin, why, coming from a direct service provider perspective, could you please speak a bit more to the role of Islamophobia as a barrier for women accessing perhaps mainstream supports and services? And I know Sabrine got us started on that, but what have you seen in your work?
Yeah, so I was going to elaborate on that actually, because I think some of the stuff that we've seen is definitely understanding that obviously Islamophobia, like Sabrine mentioned, is a problem in Canadian society, unfortunately, at this time. So it's something that impacts us, whether directly or indirectly. For example, the way that Muslims are presented in the media, the way that we're talked about and not with, or certain aspects that just reinforce these stereotypes or also just hold women back a lot. So I think some of the things that we end up seeing is not just necessarily Islamophobia taking place from service providers, but also from other clients. So we've had many cases where women come to us from other shelters. And unfortunately, a lot of times it is that, those microaggressions, right? It's not necessarily being overtly Islamophobic or overtly racist, but seeing comments that are just, oh, but doesn't Islam say you can do this or that? Or, but, what does your culture say about this? Or, why are you doing this or that? And why are you wearing this in a time where, obviously this person is in a very vulnerable position. You do have power and authority. They're just trying to get help right now. They're trying to get their affairs in order. They really do not need to be justifying themselves or explaining things or having to, defend their religion or their culture, whatever it may be. But in addition to that, we've also had many cases where other clients are responding to, Muslim women with racist or Islamophobic actions. So we've had clients that have had, garbage thrown at them, have had their hijabs pulled off, had been made fun of in certain situations. So it just makes it an unsafe environment for a lot of people. And it's actually been a very common story we've heard that, that's why I chose to go back. because you know what, at least that was something I knew, and it was a danger I knew, versus, you know, this complete unknown where not only am I on my own and having to figure everything out, but at the same time, I'm also having to defend myself and having to explain myself. We've had cases of where they're like, you know, I'll take off my hijab so I can be treated equally or fairly with, you know, by the others. So it just ends up creating a lot of extra fear and extra burdens and extra oppression. And ultimately, I think it goes back to service providers. Of course, we can't control our clients and can't control everything that happens, but when we approach it from, this is what our policy is, this is how, you know, if you're accepting our services, then you need to adhere to these policies. And also, you know, obviously policies are one side of things, and I'm not one to always harp on the policies, just because when you're dealing with clients, you have to approach them from that, you know, trying to reduce that power dynamic. And when you start harping on the rules and stuff, it just also creates an unsafe environment, or kind of a fearful environment. So a lot of times it's just having those discussions, talking about racism, talking about Islamophobia, you know, having, you know, if Ramadan is taking place, for example, right now, you know, talking about it, even if you don't have Muslim clients, even if you have regular, you know, non-Muslim clients, but talking about it, because this is an opportunity for us to start addressing these systemic issues and start talking about problems that we're seeing in society and addressing them, because it could very well happen within our shelters or our spaces, but it is also definitely happening out there. So I would say that that's one aspect to it. The other aspect I think Sabrine also mentioned, which is, you know, systemic barriers. When we talk about access to resources, we know that women that are minoritized, women that are marginalized, do have a harder time accessing services. And at the same time, they also end up being more disenfranchised because they don't have access to affordable daycare or affordable housing or equal paying jobs. A lot of times, you know, if we're talking about women without status or women without credentials that are recognized, they end up taking, you know, precarious jobs, or they end up working minimum wage jobs, or they don't have any securities, they don't have any paid time off, they don't have any support. And again, if you're talking about women that are fleeing abuse or experiencing gender-based violence, they might be on their own with their kids. They might not have the supports. So, you know, what ends up happening is they're the ones that are experiencing more of those cycles of poverty and more of those cycles of oppression. And we know that, again, that impacts these, you know, systemic barriers that impact everyone, end up impacting women that are from minorities, that are racial minorities or religious minorities more. So again, goes back to systemic issues and goes back to Islamophobia playing a role even within that kind of sphere. And I guess the last thing I want to mention with regards to that is that concept of a lot of women feeling the pressure that, you know, I don't want to feed into the stereotype of the oppressed Muslim women, so I'm not going to tell them what happened. We know on the one hand, research shows that a lot of times women that do come from minorities are not taken as seriously. And on the other hand, sometimes they are treated more severely. So especially in the cases of Children's Aid Society or you know, examples like that, it's more common that their children are taken away for very minor issues. You know, we'll talk a bit more about that later, I think. But the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of times with these situations, what ends up happening is we feel, a lot of Muslim women feel like, you know, they're asking for preferential treatment, or they don't want to go out of their way to like really show that they're Muslim, or really ask for, you know, can I get halal food, or can I eat later because Ramadan, you know, I have to break my fast later in the evening, or whatever it may be. They feel like, oh, I'm asking for too much. And so again, it goes back to, as a service provider, how are you making sure that that conversation is happening within your organization, within your staff? How are you making sure that I didn't even talk about this, but your representation within your staff, how are you making sure that, you know, if, for example, you know, you have a high demographic of Muslim women, are you making sure that you are trying to hire Muslim staff so that they can relate and support those clients? Not to say that others can't, but again, it's that representation, right? It's, you know, if you're trying to support that demographic, then you need to understand that demographic. And again, no one will understand them as well as someone within that demographic. But again, the point I'm trying to make. Sorry, I keep going into tangents. There's a lot to say, but the aspect of not making anyone feel like they're asking for preferential treatment or that they're asking for a lot, because it really should be that, we're talking about Muslim women, but once you have that perspective of we're here to be equitable and inclusive of everyone, it doesn't matter where that person is coming from or what their religion is. It's an approach that you have, and it's a framework that you have in how you approach any client. It's understanding that it's not a one-size-fits-all model. Every client does not come in the same shape, waist, form, size, none of that stuff, right? We're all unique in every way, shape, and form. So understanding that as a very bare minimum of how we approach working with clients will make sure that we're not creating that sense of like, I have to ask for everything I need. I have to request it. I have to go out of my way, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. But I should put the onus on that service provider to make sure that they understand my culture, they understand my religion, and they're supporting me in that way. I will say one last point. I apologize. I hope that's okay. But I did want to say to Yasmin's point around culture and around stigmas. I think even talking about myths also, there is, we have to also be honest and recognize that there is a stigma in society at large when it comes to violence against women. It's still something that is not being addressed to the level it should be. And that shows in the funding that, gender-based violence services get. It shows in the supports and the policies in so many ways. Just across the board, we know that we're not addressing gender-based violence in the best or in the most effective way or to the greatest degree that we could be. And we know that obviously that this impacts a lot of, minoritized communities at the same time, because what ends up happening is, when we talk about the Muslim community, for example, we're talking about a heavily newcomer community. While there are a lot of Muslims that have been here, I think Muslims date back to the late 1800s in Canada. A lot of us have come recently because of, multiculturalism and the Multiculturalism Act, and then just everything that we're trying to do right now to recruit more newcomers to our country. But what ends up happening is a lot of times these newcomers, their focus is on survival. They're coming here as skilled laborers, or they're coming here to restart their life. And the reality is that Canada, while we do a great job of trying to welcome them and being, super proud of how multicultural our community and our country is, we don't do enough to make sure that they are resettled effectively. And, we talked about this, their credentials are not qualified. The supports that are culturally responsive are not there. The supports in making sure that they have decent paying jobs and have the proper support that they need to start their lives is not there. And what ends up happening is a lot of these newcomer communities end up focusing on survival. They're focusing on, how do I put food on the table? How do I have a roof over my head? And these issues of gender-based violence, these issues of mental health, these issues of poverty, and whatever it may be, end up being things they don't want to deal with, because we cannot focus on these things when I literally do not have a place to call home, for example. So that has kind of been something that as a community has happened, and it's changing now with second generation, third generation Muslims. We are seeing a lot more of that, less focus on survival and less focus on, we're new to the country, but more focus on, how do I make Canada my home? How do I make sure that I am at home in Canada too? And that means addressing these issues as a community. So of course, we're not, I think there's no community that's perfect, but I do think that as a community we are working on these issues, and I think the next question we'll talk a bit about that. But there is room for improvement to address these stigmas and these taboos as a community in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Yasmin. You've already gotten us thinking about the next question, which was about culturally safety programming. Culturally relevant programming and the need for it. And so I'd like to invite you to share of any specific culturally relevant programming that you are aware of or that you're involved with. And if so, how can we support the work? And is there opportunity to integrate it into mainstream programming? So Sabrine, I'll start with you. Given your work with the first ever legal coordination program for Muslim women, can you describe the program, some of the elements, as well as which of these elements could be integrated into mainstream programming?
Yes. So essentially, if you have clients, so if there are service providers here who work in shelters, or you are counselors, or for any reason you are connected to a Muslim woman anywhere across Canada who is looking for legal services support. So they're looking for a lawyer, they're looking for legal counsel. They're looking to formalize a divorce. They're looking to learn more about their rights when it comes to inheritance, and so forth. Then you can contact CCMW, have your client, or fill out the client intake form for your client. And so our role as CCMW, or the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, is to connect these women with the appropriate resources. So we have this enormous roster of lawyers, legal clinics, and so forth across Canada. So when a Muslim woman fills out a client intake form, we look at the information provided, and then we connect them with the right services. This often overlaps with forms of gender-based violence, but CCMW has another project with a separate intake form that for Muslim women, again, across Canada, who are facing any form of gender-based violence. It could be a form of gendered Islamophobia, and it could not be. And both of these projects work in the same way. So our job is to receive this information, connect with the client, and then connect the client with these services and individuals that they are interested in connecting with. And then we try our best to follow up with these clients. As you know, a lot of these situations cannot be resolved overnight. A lot of these legal battles take years or months. And so we try to follow up as best as we can. And our best practice includes, of course, being survivor-centered, being client-centered. So really asking the client, what is it that you want? Often when it comes to gender-based violence or gendered Islamophobia, a woman's right to their own autonomy is taken away in those acts. And so it's really important as service providers or those who are coordinating service providers to really make sure that they have their autonomy to choose the directions in which they would like to proceed. And at any moment that they wish to stop or to pause, sometimes we have clients who take, they pause and say, actually, I'm good. I don't want to go through with this. And then months later, come back and say, I'm ready. And we try our best to be client focused. So those two projects with CCMW ring a bell. There's also organizations like the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, or SALCO. So they provide legal services to low-income Ontarians who are or who identify as South Asian. So they support women going through immigration, housing, any kind of human rights or employment law issues. So SALCO is great. Also the Barbara Schleifer Clinic, they offer legal supports, they offer counseling, they also offer interpretation services to survivors of violence, and we have a formal relationship with them. There are clients that we send to the Barbara Schleifer Clinic on a regular basis. And then there's also, a list of legal clinics that could hopefully help. And yeah, I guess I could stop there.
Thanks, Sabrine. We've been sharing the links to the work at CCMW in the chat box. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, please do so. Yasmine H., what about you? I know MRC has been doing a lot of innovative work around culturally integrative responses to family violence. Can you speak a bit more about that work and what it looks like?
Yeah, so this is sort of the passion work of our executive director, Dr. Mohammed Bawabay, thinking about the culturally integrated family safety response. And really it is thinking about, as I said before, it's thinking about shifting our approach to how we support safety for survivors. And that is the core, is thinking about how we support safety and doing it across sort of a continuum of care. So it includes prevention work, early intervention work, and then critical intervention strategies. I'll talk through a little bit about through all of them. And I think other core principle is really thinking about how we coordinate a service response, which I'll also speak to. But I think at the center is thinking about, for Muslim survivors coming forward, it's beginning to think about their context. What is the context of their everyday life? What is their family context and their faith context, and understanding the values they come with and understanding the dynamics they're embedded in. And so the term collectivist communities, I think, is often used in is central to the framework. It's understanding that family dynamics within collectivist communities involve more than the nuclear family, can involve the extended family as well. And those are important elements to integrate into thinking about how do we create safety here and what does safety look like, and thinking about their social context. And their social context is one that exists here but may also include a social context of family that are abroad, and may include also their experience of migration to Canada and the migration trauma that comes with that, the integration stressors. And so it's thinking more broadly of how we understand context as well, and then recognizing the values, like what shapes their sense of identity, their value around what it means to be in family, their faith, and those will look different for different survivors. But I think those are really key things that to think about when we begin to explore what does safety look like. And at the intervention level, I think both before intervention, I think the work of early prevention, early intervention is really key. And so when Yasmin was talking earlier about how newcomer families in particular, and this model is really grounded in a lot of the work of MRC's experience with newcomer families who've settled in London, and thinking about family safety, is that Yasmin's correct. A lot of their early period is really focused on survival. There's a great deal of stress attached to integration, and there's still a lot of migration trauma to process. But if you can build early intervention, I think really involves thinking about how do we ground people in community or families in community, and think about how we build a sense of belonging and explore things from a positive perspective as well. So I think it's not always looking at culture or faith or their experiences through a negative lens, but looking at the strengths. What are some of the protective factors that exist? But then also challenging some of maybe the harmful dynamics that might be existing at the same time, and thinking about how do we work at the family level. So I think some of the key elements of the culturally integrative response is also working beyond the individual, just the survivor themselves, thinking about what family network or what community network is the survivor embedded in and lives their daily life, and integrating the work with men, integrating the whole family in the response as well. So often I think in the work of gender-based violence, we separate out, we focus on the safety of women, but our approach has been focusing on the safety of women by excluding the work of men. And so we're isolating men who are using violence in that process. And in this work, it's thinking about how do we integrate that, because we can only create safety for survivors if we're also addressing those who are using abuse. And that might be those who are directly using abuse, but also maybe extended family members who might be reinforcing that abuse, or community members who might be involved as well. And so a culturally integrative response, I think, is not separate from what the services exist. Rather, I think there is such a focus on coordinating service and thinking about how do we work with the services that families may come into contact with, whether they're mandated or chosen, but also integrate sort of cultural communities or organizations like MRC or faith institutions, if those are important in the lives of survivors, or extended family members. So both sort of formal and informal, and thinking that they also have a role to play in working towards safety. And so it may be, I think it's a much more flexible approach. I think a lot of times our work is really guided by mandates as organizations, and mandates are, of course, important. They provide sort of security and transparency, but sometimes they also create a certain level of rigidity. And so I think it's thinking about how do we stretch that and really think about how we begin to work with what someone needs at that moment, and think about who's involved in that work. And I think there are protective factors when we engage informal networks, but also community networks as well. And so I think a lot of the work that MRC has been doing is thinking about how we coordinate a response. And so part of the practice has been strengthening that coordinated response in London. And so a lot of the key partners like ANOVA, London Abuse Women's Centre, Changing Ways, Children's Aid Society have been part of MRC's work for years. And I think currently now, my colleagues Mohammed and Ibir Al-Jamal and Ilyas Farouqi have been doing the work of how do you take that model and begin that in other communities. So I know that Ottawa, Kitchener-Waterloo, New Brunswick have also been exploring the culturally integrated family safety response, and doing the work of building relationships between organizations that are already involved, the anti-violence agencies in that community, but then also thinking about what are some of the local cultural communities that are looking to address issues of gender-based violence or family-based violence and take that seriously and begin building those relationships and having those conversations and strengthening a collective and coordinated capacity to respond and think about how we support survivors. I think that's one thing. I think there's a lot of prevention piece, but I also want Yasmin to have an opportunity to speak as well. So.
Sure. Well, thank you, Yasmin. I really appreciate your point on the need for strengths-based approaches when working with survivors and how could we strengthen the already existing protective factors in their lives. Yasmin, why? I was wondering, I know you had touched on some of the culturally integrative relevant programming that you've been doing through NISA Homes, but I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that programming and if has there been opportunities or will there be opportunities for collaboration for this sort of programming to be integrated through the various services that exist right now across the GBV sector?
Yeah, definitely. I think we've, one of the great things is, being a national organization, we've worked with a lot of other shelters, with a lot of other GBV organizations, and we've constantly had that question come up as, okay, I have a Muslim client or I have someone that seems to be Muslim. What do I do? How do I help them? Where do I go for this or that? And we're always very happy, obviously, to answer that and to support in any way. And I appreciate service providers taking that step. And I think that's maybe the first thing I do want to recognize is that, obviously culturally relevant services do exist, but that doesn't mean that we just put the onus on them anytime we have, a client from that culture or anything, that we just refer them there and that's it. I don't have to deal with it anymore. The reality is you're going to have those clients approach your organization and access your services. So you do still need to do your part to educate yourself, to educate your staff, to make sure that your services are inclusive and are equitable in that sense. So we do appreciate that when organizations reach out. We've also done trainings with other organizations where we talk about what does it mean to support Muslim women experiencing domestic violence or gender-based violence? What does it look like? What are their needs? How can you make your shelters more inclusive? And a lot of times, I'm focusing on shelters because that's our area of expertise, but we've also worked with other organizations like settlement organizations that have also wanted to start similar shelters and transitional homes for their specific cultural communities. So it's something that is growing. I think we are seeing a lot more shelters kind of try to focus on specific demographics or work towards that at least. But we're also seeing a lot of shelters try to educate themselves and support themselves in better supporting those clients. And it really is small things. I think that's what a lot of people kind of are surprised by, that, how do we make it more inclusive and accessible? Well, it's, something as simple as providing the halal food. It can be something that you always do. It doesn't have to be something that you do just for the Muslim clients. Everyone can eat halal food. It's halal meat. It just makes it easy and it makes it less, again, of a burdensome request that I have to go out of my way to request. Whereas, and we've seen restaurants do this. We've seen universities do this where they'll just take that approach. It makes it, makes their life easier, really. And it's other things too, right? Having a space that's, a spiritual or safe space or a prayer space, making sure that, if you have religious books, you have religious books for multiple religions, not just, the Bible or whatever it may be, just making sure that and it's not even just the Bible and the Quran. You want to try and, again, make it as inclusive as possible for everyone. So these are things that basically just allow for us to create that cultural responsiveness within every organization. And we're happy, obviously, for whenever people do reach out, we're very happy to provide that training and provide that information. I know Sabrine mentioned a few organizations that I think are great. Also, I do know that there's a Muslim Children's Aid that recently started. I do know also even within, again, mainstream service providers, PLCAS, for example, they started a program that's it's called a cultural brokers program. So whenever they have calls coming in from certain communities, I think they have a Black community one, and they have a Muslim community, an Arab community. They have a few, and a South Asian community. And so they have cultural brokers from those communities that will always go and a company, whatever CAS worker is going to speak to a family or interview a family, whatever they may need to do. And they've seen actually the number of cases where they've had to take the children away, reduce, I think, by like 70% or something, just by having a cultural broker that can allow for that mutual understanding of what's going on and allow for that education, allow for that information. Because again, we know in a lot of those situations, it is not necessarily, it's a lot of times it's neglect and it's not necessarily abuse, but again, they get, the more severe responses, unfortunately. I did want to add one point to what Yasmin had said earlier with regards to using culture as a protective factor, essentially. We've seen that a lot with the work that we do, and we actually have other service providers reaching out to us, asking us, how are you getting them jobs? How are you getting them housing so fast? And our answer is really quite simple. We use our community. So we actually do go to the community where, we'll tell them, hey, we need jobs. We need you guys to hire these clients, and obviously we don't do it as in like, we ensure the safety of the clients and everything, but we'll also go and tell them, hey, we need affordable housing. If you're renting out a basement, let us know. And we have so many community members ready to help and willing to help and wanting to help. So, yes, a lot of times we frame community and we frame culture as a problem or as there's a stigma or it's holding them back or anything like that. But it really can be a protective factor when we think of it that way of like, people wanting to support. We've also seen incredible support from communities and from cultures where, from within the Muslim community and the Muslim culture that, they stand up, let's say, for example, again, the extended family being very heavily involved in some cases, they will be the ones, they will respond even before the woman reaches out for help. And they're like, hey, this is not acceptable. We're gonna take our daughter home until you do X, Y, Z. And making that stance to support those clients. I'm not saying it's perfect. And I know there is room for improvement, but it's that framework and it's the way we approach it. If we do approach it as, a problematic, and a harmful factor, then it definitely will end up being that way. But if we try to use the benefits and we try to use it as a protective factor, there is a lot of room for that. And I see, Yasmin, I know you have your hand up. Why don't you, I was going to say one last point,
sure,
but if
Yasmin, would you like to respond to Yasmin?
No, please say that your last point. I just am in total agreement with what you're saying, and it just sparked something, but please finish your train of thought.
Are you sure you're not going to forget it though?
No, I won't.
Perfect. I think the last point I wanted to mention was, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here, that again, when we talk about cultural responsiveness, it is also talking about making sure that you as a service provider are educated. So if you're in a community where it is a heavily Muslim community, or it is a heavily Black community, or whatever community it may be, the onus again is on you to go and get that education. Attending a webinar like this is a great first step, learning about those communities, learning how you can support them, and understanding how you can, what you can do and the changes that you can make on a policy level, on a program level, and on a practical level make a big difference. Because again, there is a power dynamic. There is a lot at play when someone is reaching out for supports and for services, that we need to make sure that we are meeting them, if not halfway, then, the full way, to make sure that, again, they're getting that effective support and we're helping them in the way that works for them, and not just simply, this is what we can do, you take it or you leave it. It really is, we're a multicultural community, we're a multicultural country. We need to make sure that our services are reflective of that too.
Thanks so much, Yasmin. Yasmin, would you like to share your thoughts?
No, I just, I think when Yasmin was talking about that, too often we do think about culture or faith as barriers, or I think it goes back to the myths, that there are all these negative myths or assumptions attached to that. And I think looking at culture and faith communities as a protective factors, I think is really key. And so I think even thinking about the role of faith leaders, I think that's a key area of work within MRC, but I know that all our organizations have done work in this area as well. And so I think too often there might be an assumption that faith leaders cannot play a positive role, or faith communities cannot play a positive role in addressing gender-based violence. And that's not to say that there aren't areas of growth, but there's areas of growth for all of us. I think it's just identifying what those areas of growth are and where we need to strengthen those capacities, because I think there's capacity building that all of us can do to really improve ongoing. Like I think we're on learning in ways constantly that improve our services and supports for survivors. And so I think the capacity building and engagement of faith leaders is also key. And then providing them with the ability, like with the capacity or skills to recognize abuse, take seriously abuse, forms of abuse, and think about their responses, their role of what support looks like, and then also be connected to other organizations, and to be able to make referrals or to be engaged and in the process of providing support. And I think there's great strength there. And I think it's just always thinking more creatively about what we need and what that survivor needs and who those protective resources are for that survivor, and also who can be engaged in then challenging abuse or holding accountable those who are using abuse. And I think that's a key area of work also, thinking about creating safety is also about accountability and work with those who are using abuse, as I mentioned before, like thinking about how do we work and not isolate men from the process of creating safety. And I think, our work has shown there may, again, part of the assumptions or myths is that maybe addressing issues of gender-based violence is difficult within Muslim communities. I think, as was said before by Sabrine and Yasmin, it's difficult in all our communities. We're constantly raising awareness about issues of gender-based violence, taking and putting at the front the impacts and harms of gender-based violence. And survivors are constantly being asked for their stories to be taken seriously, their experiences, their harm to be taken seriously, and for them to have access to justice or access to safety and access to care. I think that's true for all survivors, but in particular marginalized survivors. But I think the work of being able to do prevention within Muslim communities does exist. And I think there's opportunities. And I think it's just about the approach and the starting point. And I think, again, even within the work within Muslim communities, there's no one size fits all. So our work of doing work with post-secondary students will look different than the work we do with newcomer communities, because the starting point or what that conversation needs to look like, or where that awareness starts and where that community dialogue starts, is in a different place. And I think that's a really important piece to recognize as well. And I know my colleague, Tahrid Al-Samairi, and I have really worked throughout the period of the pandemic, thinking about how do we engage newcomer communities on the issue of thinking about intimate partner violence more specifically. And so we worked with, newcomer women to develop and deliver a program that can be delivered in Arabic, but also in English, but thinking about what it means to offer peer support to someone and the importance of being there, being able to offer peer support to someone, and building their knowledge both on recognizing forms of abuse and warning signs, thinking about what are the norms that exist in our community that we can challenge, and the responses that might be harmful that we can shift, and thinking through that and talking through that, and then also thinking about what they can do and what do those principles look like. And we've developed sort of a trauma-informed and culturally informed guide that gives people the steps, concrete steps, where they can both have the knowledge, but then also implement some skills to supporting a loved one, a friend or a family member who may disclose or who might be experiencing abuse. And I think that is key. And I think what we've seen is that women are really interested, and they're best, once they're engaged, I think then they're the best promoters in terms of thinking about other women to be engaged and to be involved. And I think I think there's a lot of great opportunity in the work, sort of community-based education work, and sort of thinking about community-based organizations that are doing work to support safety for survivors.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yes. Because I think that was great. I actually forgot to mention this earlier. I mean, I know in the past we've done a workshop with imams, who are religious leaders in the Muslim community, with MRC, and we brought them together, and the basis of it was talking about the misconceptions around domestic violence and the misconceptions around gender-based violence from an Islamic perspective. And I guess this also ties back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the myths and misconceptions. And I think that's a really big one that we haven't talked about yet, which is unfortunately, there are misconceptions around religious texts. I think Sabrine did mention this briefly. There are misconceptions and misinterpretations of religious texts that end up being used to justify abuse or to justify certain things incorrectly and wrongly. And there is a huge movement against this by many religious scholars, by many religious organizations. It's something that's growing. It's something that's, gaining momentum. And I want to say that, the three organizations we have here are three organizations that are from the Muslim community, by the Muslim community, for the Muslim community, and showing that, the Muslim community is not okay with these things and is doing something about them. I always like to give this as an example that Nissa Homes was funded primarily through community donations by the Muslim community. We were able to open up about 6 of our homes 100% funded by the government. 100% funded by the community, not by the government. And that in and of itself speaks volumes to the fact that, again, we have that support from the community and the community is trying to work on these things. There is room for improvement, but there is a lot of movement happening around reclaiming the narrative and reclaiming the definitions and the Quranic verses or the hadith that speak to domestic violence and speak to violence against women, and going back to what a lot of the teachings are in favor of and how they are often, giving women the rights and protecting their rights and ensuring that they are given those supports from a community and from the religion. And it's gaining its traction. And I think, again, the fact that we're here and talking about this is evidence of that.
I'd agree. Sorry if I'm just going to add in, but I do think there is a lot of recognition around the responsibility. And so I think in speaking to, I just want to sort of build off of Yasmin's point around sort of the engagement of imams. I do think there is work in women who have reached out, may have not always had the most positive experience, and may have also the same way in terms of where they've reached out to some service providers where they felt re-victimized or experienced a further form of violence, may have experienced that and reaching out to faith leaders as well. But I also think there is a real recognition in terms of shifting that. I think imams are seeing more and more, or faith leaders are seeing more and more, that people are, individuals or worshipers or congregants, members of the community are coming to them with issues that are around, that address, that are about family violence or gender-based violence or other social concerns. And they are not trained to respond to that, but I think are recognizing they do have a leadership role and can play a really big part in part of the work around prevention and education by correcting misunderstandings, as Yasmin said, where there are misinterpretations of Quranic texts. And I know my colleague, Imam Abdel Fattah Tawakkol, worked over years to develop like a 6-part khutbah series that is really is for imams to deliver Friday sermons or khutbahs in the mosques about issues of gender-based and family violence, and beginning to take those issues seriously, correct misinterpretations of texts, and really center what are the values within our faith that basically implore us or motivate us to take seriously gender-based violence and work towards the safety of survivors, and what is our responsibility as individuals, but also as a community in that.
And I think that's, sorry, again, I'm just going to add a little point to that, but I think that this is, a cultural shift and a paradigm shift in general, because, we've been around since 2015, and I remember the same, imams and mosques we used to try to reach out to, and the doors were closed, or they just were not willing to speak to us, are now the ones that are actually funding us. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely shifting, and the narrative is definitely changing. And I think, hopefully it's going to continue to do that and grow from there.
This is such a great conversation, and I just want to give an opportunity to Sabrine to see, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add, Sabrine, to this conversation?
I do want to say that, both Yasmines made great points. Absolutely, there is a shift happening. And we do talk about some of the interpretations of Islam as misinterpretations, but I do think that there are some traditional interpretations specifically of, and I think it was touched in one of the Q&A questions, verse 434, so about really gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. And there's also verses about polygamy where there are interpretations that are deemed either traditional or highly conservative that do or may encourage or facilitate forms of at least mistreatment towards women. So I know with the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, we have worked with scholars like Dr. Naveen Redda, who has an article on a different interpretation of the verse, I think it was 434. But I think it is important to mention that there are imams that we have tried to connect with that were not interested, and that you're absolutely right, both of Yasmin Y and Yasmin H, that we have seen a shift. Some of those very imams that absolutely refused to engage with us are now engaging and attending our events and programming. We do have a roster of some imams, and it is slowly growing. But I do want to mention that there are interpretations of Islam that may not be the most helpful for women going through various forms of violence.
Thanks so much, Sabrine. Well, this brings us to the end of the panel discussion portion of the webinar. And so we'll now move into the Q&A portion. There's been lots of questions coming in from participants. My colleague, Sabri Abdel-Sadi, will be joining me to ask questions. Sabri, if you're ready, could I ask you to start us off with the first question, please?
Sure.
Thanks, Sabri.
Yes. So the first question is, can you recommend some ways that social workers and other service providers can examine or reflect on their own BA and internalized Islamophobia?
I could kind of get started with this. I think for myself, one of the main things is two main things that I think we can approach. The fact that you're asking this question is a very good start. And I would say that the best thing to do is to look for educational resources. And I think that you will, there's no questionnaire that's going to tell you, yes, you're biased, or yes, you haven't, internalized racism or anything like that. I think the best solution is to access resources and information and educational resources. And there is so much that exists out there. I mean, we live in a day and age where everything is at our fingertips on the internet. So I would say that that's definitely, obviously also being mindful of what information you're getting from the internet. But I would say that it's definitely the first place. And I think having those conversations is the second point that I would say, that have those conversations with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, having those conversations with people also that look different from you and speak different from you or have a different background than you, and have those conversations to get a better understanding of what it is that their lived experiences or the challenges they face, approach it from that perspective that, you want to learn, but also make sure you've done your homework. You're not just telling them, tell me about your culture, and then you sit and listen. Again, that's putting the onus on them to have to explain everything to you. At the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is, I've read about this, is this true? Is this something that I can, reflect on? Is there something that, I could learn more about? Can you direct me to a place where I can learn more resources or get more information? And also, most importantly, is approaching it from a place of cultural humility, understanding that you don't know everything and that you're not expected to know everything, but you are expected to know that you're not, no one is, more superior than the other. And there's really that understanding that I'm here as a colleague and a comrade, that I want to learn and I want to support my clients and I want to be able to support those that reach out to me in the best way possible. So I think that's kind of, I hope that answers the question, but that for me is the first place to start.
Thanks, Yasmin. I'll just let you know that Sabri is no longer with us. His connection wasn't strong, so I'll be taking over the Q&A. But Yasmin or Sabrine, would you like to add to the points made by Yasmin? So the question again was, can you recommend some ways that social workers and other service providers can examine or reflect on their own biases and internalized Islamophobia?
Okay, so I could add very briefly that you can ask yourself I just want to make sure I'm not muted. Okay. And you can ask your organization, are the policies and the programs and the service delivery practices effective and appropriate for Muslim women and girls facing gender-based violence? So for example, do they exclude or create barriers for Muslim women and girls facing any form of GBV? If the policies and programs and services are specifically targeted towards members of Muslim communities, do they have consequences for different groups within or outside Muslim communities? You can also get into, do they take into account the different experiences and barriers and needs of Muslim women and girls facing gender-based violence based on their intersectional identity, so their gender identity, gender expression, race, sexuality, sectarian differences, and so forth. What are the strengths and gaps within your own programming? What can be improved? So CCMW actually has a GBV review guide that organizations can take. So I encourage everyone here who is a service provider to take this guide to your organization. So it involves a review of all your policies and programs and service delivery practices. And the goal is to assist your organization with the review process so that you can use this as a resource to assess what your gaps are and where changes are needed. It's great for service providers, community organizations, religious institutions, and so forth. And do I want to add anything else? I think what Yasmin said about cultural humility and practicing that is absolutely imperative. And I do want to give the other Yasmin H a chance to speak to in case you'd like to.
No, I don't have too much more to add. I mean, I think both Yasmin and Sabrine did a beautiful job covering things. I think there is a lot. I mean, I think there's individual reflective practice, but I really appreciate that CCMW has created this guide for there to be sort of an organizational review. And I think that's really key. I'm thinking about, when you're working with survivors of abuse, even thinking about like, how do you carry out risk assessment and how do you understand risk and sometimes, or how do you understand safety? And sometimes we have a particular lens based on sort of experience working with particular populations where risk looks this way or risk or threat management happens this way and or safety planning or safety looks this way. And so I think sometimes it's challenging those ideas or recognizing, I think, your client casework. I also think client case reviews are really important, thinking about like, how did this case and having conversations as an organization and then using the tool that CCMW created to guide you through that. I think those are really important elements, is thinking about how did our work with, this Muslim survivor, how did that unfold, or where were some of the gaps and where were some of the challenges? I think there are a lot of big questions and I think there is a lot of discomfort because I do think we all hold biases, and I think it's really doing the work of uncovering how are those biases integrated in our work individually, but also thinking about how are those biases may be integrated in how our organization works as and implements our policies and practices in our work with clients directly, and how do those show up? And so I think that is a collective work, and I think that is difficult work and uncomfortable work, but I think really important work that needs to happen.
And if I can just quickly add, it can be as small as just recognizing that there's different ways to greet people. So there are some Muslim women, for example, who don't like to shake hands with people who identify as men. And just a simple gesture of putting your hand over your heart could start developing that trust and understanding.
Thanks for adding that, Sabrine. The next question that's come up is, to what extent, based on your knowledge, to what extent are custody and other family dissolution decisions being made in more private alternate courts or religious contexts in Islamic communities in Canada? Are there needs or barriers to improving prevention and awareness in these contexts that may be different than more public state court processes and contexts?
That's a great question. I will say that at the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, we've worked with scholars and lawyers and have made the decision that we believe that focusing primarily on Canadian family law is the best way to ensure that you have your greatest access to justice. Now, we are very aware of the gaps within Canadian family law or the Canadian justice system as it is. We are very aware that there are significant barriers in accessing justice, but we do believe that when we relocate imams in private spaces to decide for both parties or all parties, that the access to justice reduces or can significantly reduce itself. So when it comes to family law, there's a lot to touch on. I think there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of women who come to us and they are really unsure. You know, marriage is talked about all the time. It's something that we all, you know, who's getting married, who's getting divorced. It's always a subject that we speak of very highly or repetitively, but the ins and outs of the legal processes, we don't really know. So I know, for example, when I was getting married, there were so many traditions that I was unaware of, and how to practice those in Canada. I think many of us are pioneers. We're just learning. So my parents came from Palestine. So the way they did things, they wanted me to do that here. And then trying to retain my faith and my traditions, but doing it in a way that best secures my own rights. It felt like I was doing this on my own. So there is a Muslim marriage toolkit that CCMW provides. Again, you can contact CCMW, or I'm sure any of the three organizations with these questions, and we can try our best to support you. But we do encourage Muslim women to follow family law in their proceedings.
Thanks, Sabrine. Yasmin and Yasmin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I agree wholeheartedly with Sabrine that, you know, we're here and you can't follow laws and rules that are back home or wherever they may be. And a lot of, like, I know a lot of imams, for example, when so in Muslim marriage ceremonies, you have the religious ceremony. They won't do the religious ceremony without you having done the civil, like the getting registered, your marriage registration and all of that. So that, and then same thing applies with divorce. You know, a lot of imams will tell you now that, you know, a legal divorce is sufficient. You don't need to get a religious divorce or anything. And so we do follow the legal system here and the family law system here. And that, again, would be my recommendation above all else, just like Sabrine said.
Yeah, and I concur. So I agree. Like, I think with both Yasmin and Sabrine, I think the Canadian legal system, this is the context we live in, and that takes precedent. And I would agree with Yasmin too, that I think I don't know the extent of conversation, but I do know that also amongst imams, like as Yasmin said, around marriage and also divorce, that even Islamic divorce certificates formally won't be issued until there's a Canadian divorce is finalized. And so that's practice amongst some, but maybe not standardized. And I do think that's where sort of the ongoing work or shift does need to happen, where, you know, all imams are sort of practicing along the same lines. And I do think there is work in that direction. And I think too, there's a lot, along with the guide that CCMW created in terms of sort of marriage here, there are a lot now, I think, more efforts even thinking about sort of before people enter into marriage, doing sort of programs or awareness programs in terms of what does it mean to be in a marriage, what are your rights. And so I know that, you know, in the US, Peaceful Families Project has been sort of pioneering some of this work, but I think that it's also happening here in Canada. So I think there's different sort of prevention education elements too that sort of think about what does marriage mean in Canada, and what are sort of the both responsibilities of having a healthy marriage, but also sort of the rights that exist under Canadian law and how to access those rights, but also then within an Islamic framework. So Yasmin, I don't know if you wanted to add. Yeah.
I did want to add just a small thing to that is, especially when we're working with clients, even though that might be our approach and it might be the you know, our recommendation is that you do go through the legal system. A lot of times clients, you know, they come again with that fear of the system and the government. And so while we might be encouraging them to do that. And we know that this is the best way that protects their rights and ensures they get, whether it's child support or they get custody or whatever it may be. But the reality is that it might not just be simply as it might not be as simple as telling them you need to go through the legal system. Sometimes it needs to come from someone that they trust, or they are willing to, to listen to the advice that they're giving them. And I think this maybe also goes back to the last question we were talking about in terms of the cultural responsiveness, in that maybe having those resources in your community for local imams that you've worked with, or maybe reaching out to, again, one of the 3 organizations here to find out maybe what are mosques or imams that we've worked with that we would recommend working with, because we've seen it happen with many of our clients, that I might tell them this is the best thing to do, this is what secures your future and your kids' future, but they won't listen to me, especially because I'm obviously not a religious scholar. So sometimes it does need to come from a religious scholar. Sometimes they'll just want to hear it from them, and then they'll be like, okay, sure, I'll do it. And it's understanding that this is, these are their values and their priorities. It's not my place to judge. It's not my place to think that this is less than or anything. It's just, this is what they trust and what they are okay with, and supporting them in getting access to that and in getting the right information. Again, don't just reach out to anyone. There is, unfortunately, like Sabrine said, not everyone we've worked with has had the same outlook and has had the same approach to the work that we do. So making sure that whoever you are reaching out to is someone maybe that we've already worked with, or we already know what their response will be, or that they are on the same wavelength as us.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So the next question is, are there specific resources for Muslim women without permanent residency who are escaping an abuser that has permanent residency? What gaps exist, and how can any resources or services be more effective? Would you like to start us off, Sabrine?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the sad thing is that there are quite a few clients who contact us, and we try our best to support them, but sometimes, and this is one of those issues where sometimes the system is really not in your favor. So we do have, for example, an emergency bursary fund that client could possibly access. Which can give them up to $1,000 to just support them in this emergency financial situation. We can connect them with lawyers, but it's difficult because retaining legal aid has a whole bunch of criteria. And so I think there's another question about if we offer just legal counsel or legal representation. So it's really both. So if someone's looking for just a free consultation, we'll set them up with quite a few. If someone's looking to retain a lawyer, often through legal aid, we can set that up. But there are quite a few barriers for women who don't have permanent residency.
Thanks, Sabrine.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, so we one of our very first policies was that we made sure we're able to accept and support clients that don't have permanent residency or don't have status. So we do get a lot of clients that are refugee claimants or don't have any status whatsoever. And we do support them in that process. It is a very difficult process though. And unfortunately, there are such few resources for those clients. Many shelters don't accept them. They don't, until you have sometimes until you've started the process, and there's different stages of the process, you will not be eligible for certain benefits. So you can't get welfare, you can't get child tax benefits, you can't do all these things, even while you're applying for certain residency options. So it is a very difficult process, unfortunately. I wish there were more resources. I wish I had a better answer, but I will say that there is legal aid does help in many of these cases, that you can get legal aid to support in applying for a refugee claim or humanitarian compassionate grounds. But it is, unfortunately, it is probably one of the hardest situations because you're probably in a limbo for about a year or so. If you're lucky, we've had clients that are, in longer limbos where they can't work. They're not legally allowed to work. They're not legally allowed to get any government assistance. They're basically just supposed to somehow survive. And it really is an unfair situation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that highlights the importance of advocacy, and that these are issues that, span across the Muslim community as well, in terms of thinking about women who experience abuse from different backgrounds, faith, cultural, who don't have permanent residency status and are in situations of abuse. And so I think that speaks to sort of the wider advocacy around just really centering gender-based violence and making it a national priority, and really addressing the unique needs of especially marginalized populations or marginalized women who are experiencing abuse in our country and communities.
I'm looking at the clock. There's so many more questions, but we are running out of time for Q&A. So Sabrine, Yasmin, and Yasmin, thank you so much for this rich discussion and for sharing your important insights. We're so grateful for your time and expertise. A big thank you to the ASL interpreters from the Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service, Jessica and Joanne, and to the French language interpreters, Caroline and Sylvie, for your support. I do want to remind folks to please don't forget to complete the evaluation survey to receive a certificate of participation. That survey will automatically open up in your browser once the webinar ends. And lastly, we did send out a relevant resources list this morning in your inboxes that contains a number of resources and links if you would like to continue your learning on this topic. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this webinar, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.